Fascism isn't unique to America. In fact, it's becoming increasingly common all throughout the world, notably in Italy, France, Germany, the UK, Hungary, Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere. And the rise of fascism is a direct result of the collapse in global capitalism, because when people's material conditions aren't met for so long, they begin to feel desperate, and that desperation makes them susceptible to radicalization, which is often exploited by opportunistic politicians who scapegoat minorities for the failures of the system. But fascist demagogues never actually improve material conditions for working people once they take power. Rather, they consolidate power and reinforce the existing capitalist status quo, but through force, since the system can no longer be sustained through normal democratic means, seeing as how it's lost popular support. But think about why capitalism always devolves into fascism. Why does this happen? See, once oligarchs accumulate so much power and wealth by rigging the system against everyone else, working people begin to question why things have gotten so bad. And fascists give them an answer to that question. It's minorities. It's immigrants, trans people, black and brown people. It's not the right answer, obviously, but it's an answer nonetheless. And that thought process is exemplified with tweets like this. Quote, "I am becoming more and more convinced that the vast majority of America's problems could be solved by deporting immigrants. Housing, healthcare, wages, inflation, traffic, huge amounts of crime." And he adds, "I'm genuinely starting to wonder if nearly all the problems in America today could be fixed by just deporting 100% of undocumented immigrants." Yeah, it's not the endless greed of billionaires or the system that allowed them to exist in the first place. It's other working class people. And this idiot didn't come to this conclusion on his own volition. He's likely parroting propaganda that was paid for by billionaires who are doing everything that they can to prevent working class people from having the class solidarity that rich people have with each other. Because as Zoran Mamdani put it, it's a benefit for them to get somebody making $30 an hour to hate somebody making $20 an hour. Because if you're focused on the least fortunate, you might not notice how the most fortunate are robbing you blind. Now, I'm not a class reductionist. I'm not saying that bigotry and racism will suddenly vanish if you address people's material conditions. But if you do shift power and wealth to workers by disempowering elites, you do remove at least some of the gasoline that demagogues use to fuel the fires of fascism. It's why socialism is seen as the antidote to fascism. But here's the thing. As bad as it is now, we could see an even worse, turbocharged version of fascism in a few decades because of one major issue that we've chosen to not address. And that issue is climate change. As Common Dreams reports, if we don't cut emissions by 50% by 2030, we're not going to be able to hit our target of passing a global rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as Climate Action Tracker points out, we're projected to see a 2.6 degree global rise in temperatures since we've made no progress towards the goals set out in the Paris Climate Accord in the 10 years since it was adopted. And to say that this is going to be catastrophic would be an understatement, because by 2050, there could be up to 1.2 billion, that's billion with a B, climate refugees from developing countries in Africa, the Middle East, and island nations after climate change makes all of their homes uninhabitable, which is going to cause resource scarcity and fuel conflicts. And the richest 1%, i.e. the billionaires and multimillionaires who are disproportionately responsible for the climate change crisis, know that this is coming, which is why they're currently building doomsday bunkers to prepare for the climate apocalypse that they caused. And what's crazy is that wars over water will become a common phenomenon, yet we're letting tech billionaires build data centers for generative AI slop that's consuming the drinkable water that we need to survive. And you already know that we're not going to have to wait until the end of the century to see the consequences of climate change, because we're already seeing it. We're all seeing it. Hurricane seasons have become intense. We're seeing more extremes on both ends, hotter hots, colder colds. There's a fire season every year now, basically, with fire tornadoes. And in the near future, luxury goods could become more scarce, like chocolate and coffee. And by mid-century, around the time millennials will be old enough to retire, Van R. Newkirk paints a really bleak picture about what climate change will do to America by mid-century, writing, quote, "Over the next 30 years or so, the changes to American life might be short of apocalyptic, but miles of heartbreak lie between here and the apocalypse, and the future toward which we are heading will mean heartbreak for millions. Many people will go in search of new homes in cooler, more predictable places. Those travelers will leave behind growing portions of America where services and comforts will be in short supply. Let's call them dead zones. Should the demolition of America's rule of law continue, authoritarianism and climate change will reinforce each other, a vicious spiral from which it will be difficult to exit. And that last sentence is a huge concern because all of the political conditions that led to fascism will be exacerbated by climate change, and it could reinforce fascism in a way where it becomes unstoppable globally. But before we catastrophize about that too much, let's first talk about the political implications of climate change just here at home. It could trigger mass migration just domestically from hurricane and tornado-prone states to more stable regions of the country. And that alone could create political instability and fuel partisanship or even political realignment if states don't do enough to adapt or accommodate the needs of larger populations. And if people from the South seek refuge in the North, for example, and they need resources from the state when they arrive at their new homes, the people who are already living there might get jealous and become less welcoming. But the people who can't move to more stable areas of the country will remain in areas that have been devastated, dead zones, as Newkirk called them. They'd live in desolate regions that are impoverished and just empty. It could cause economic panic in those areas due to, a collapse in property value since nobody wants to live there. Grocery stores wouldn't be able to make a profit and would probably shut down, creating food deserts and a scarcity of certain goods. And if the government is going to meet these needs for people in these regions, they have to do it in a substantial way because corporations simply aren't going to service these areas if they can't make a profit off of them. Now, Newkirk argues that things won't get so bad by mid-century that entire states would become unlivable, but even just small, subtle changes in our way of life could lead to massive political and economic upheaval. But it'd pale in comparison to what would happen in developing countries. Newkirk goes on to explain, the worst climate disruptions will happen beyond U.S. borders, but they will put pressure on American society nonetheless. Migration to the southern border, perhaps the most powerful current in American politics today, is already being driven partly by ecological collapses in Central American farm economies. International monitors expect these pressures to grow over the next several years. If the country's policy today is at all indicative, detention camps for immigrants will proliferate, often in climate dead zones, and the southern border will become even more militarized. This would not be an America where the founding ideals hold much sway. The movement of people might even set states against one another. Tensions in receiving zones will, without strong growing economies, create more opportunities for demagoguery. In dead zones, the dearth of public services and the fading imprimatur of the state will naturally erode local participatory democracy. All of this could create even better conditions than those today for the kind of transactional authoritarian government that Trump is trying to establish. Xenophobia and racism are already pillars of this movement, and they would be strengthened by mass migration. State and local leaders affected by disasters might supplicate themselves to the president in order to receive the patronage of disaster aid. A hurricane or mega fire during election season might be a convenient excuse for federal intervention. The emerging Trump doctrine views empathy as a weakness and public welfare as a usurpation of the natural hierarchy. His authoritarianism is perfectly suited to an era of climate strife. So, with the prospect of 1.2 billion climate refugees by 2050, most of which will have to be welcomed by developed countries, you can already imagine the ways that fascists are going to exploit that crisis for political gain. They'll encourage tribalism and more nationalism that will resonate with Americans, not because climate refugees will make their lives worse, but because their lives will already be bad because of climate change, and climate refugees will be easy scapegoats. And just ask yourself, do you think that our government is prepared to deal with all of these issues by 2050? I think we all know the answer to that question. A government that lets 68,000 Americans die every single year due to a lack of healthcare isn't going to give a shit about desperate populations who've lost everything due to climate change. If they don't care about you literally dying, they sure as fuck aren't going to give a damn about you losing your home due to climate change. Cronyism could become even more rampant, and corrupt politicians are probably going to try to further enrich billionaires and by then trillionaires in order to get on their good side, so that way maybe they could be welcomed into their doomsday bunkers or get rich enough to build their own doomsday bunkers. The question is, what are we supposed to do? And I do have two simple answers. The first and most obvious is to obviously address climate change directly, both in terms of mitigation to the extent that we still can, and adaptation. We have to simultaneously try to stop what's coming, but also prepare for the worst case scenario. But that's easier said than done, of course, because our economic system is fueling the crisis, so you can't meaningfully address climate change unless you address the system itself. But the problem is there's just no political appetite for that because Americans, quite frankly, don't give a shit about climate change, even though it's already affecting them. See for yourself.
The worry in terms of climate change, simply put, hasn't shifted. It has not reached the majority of Americans. What are we talking about? Greatly worried about climate change. You go all the way back to 1989, it was 35%. 2000, 40%. 2020, 46%. And in 2025, look at that. It's 40%, the same number as we had 25 years ago back in 2000, and then only just 5 points higher than we had back in 1989. Really, we've just seen consistency on this issue. The bottom line is that the climate change message that folks who, of course, believe that climate change is real and is quite worrisome, simply put, has not really worked with the American people. Top issue facing the United States, climate change. It was 3% in 2021, 2% on average of polls in 2023, and this year the average of polls 2. It is very, very low on the list of priorities. I was trying to count it out in the Gallup poll, and basically it was so low down, I was counting all the different issues, almost lost track. It was like 15th or 20th. It was just very, very low down. So the bottom line is not only are we seeing that the number has not really moved over the last 36 years, but in terms of being the top issue, it simply put has not broken through.
It's bleak. And that's a failure on part of our media and policymakers. But to be fair, climate change is one of those issues that affects us in a more indirect and circuitous way. And because of that, it just doesn't feel like it's the number one cause. For example, like if you lose your home due to a hurricane or fire fueled by climate change, sure, that's a consequence of climate change, but your primary concern isn't going to be we should address climate change. It's going to be your immediate needs, food, shelter, housing, not climate change itself. So that's why this is so difficult. I think we all kind of subconsciously view this as something that's far off, a distant threat that, needs to be addressed only after we address more salient material issues first. And unfortunately, I just don't think that countries are going to be able to meet the moment by 2030, which means that our fate is pretty much sealed. So in terms of what we do, the second answer to that question is to kill capitalism before it kills us. Again, easier said than done. But this isn't something that we're going to be able to do in time to prevent a climate catastrophe. So the next best thing is to lay the groundwork to create an economic system where resources aren't hoarded by the richest 1% of people. So that way, by the time shit really hits the fan, there will already be a more equitable distribution of wealth, and governments will be more capable of dealing with various crises, including mass migration. Because think about it. If Americans have healthcare and housing and a livable wage, most, I think, will feel more inclined, not all, but most will feel more inclined to welcome climate refugees if they don't feel like it's going to be a zero-sum game where they're going to have to compete with even more people for resources that are increasingly scarce. But politicians just won't have to deliver materially alone. Like, they'll need to foster an empathetic society that values multiculturalism and views immigration as the net positive that it is. But this means that we would effectively have to undo decades of capitalist brainwashing to even get to the point where racist-ass Americans would consider welcoming climate refugees from developing countries without throwing temper tantrums. But I want to be clear. This is not a change that is going to take place overnight. And the reality is that people will view immigrants and other marginalized groups as the cause of all of their problems of the present and future if we don't give them a new common enemy to hate. And that's where the left has to come in. We have to build class solidarity among the working class now by demonizing rich people, explicitly so. We have to get Americans to open their eyes and see rich people as the cause of all of their problems, because they are. Step number one is just getting them to stop hating the wrong 1% and start hating the right 1%. Once they understand that they have nothing because the rich has everything, that's when you'll have enough popular will to actually make meaningful changes to the system, redistribute wealth, which will then enable us to build a government more capable of adapting to a climate-induced dystopia that's only decades away. But if we can't overcome inertia and things stay the same and just continue to get worse year after year, be prepared. because turbocharged fascism that's on the horizon is going to be powerful enough to swallow us whole. And I don't want that to happen. So I think we need to help people understand how fascism, capitalism, and climate change are all interconnected. It is a three-headed beast that you can't slay unless you cut off all three heads.